All right, with that, we're going to go ahead and start today's webinar. Thank you for joining another Mass Medic webinar. My name is Nicole Owens. I'm the Director of Marketing Communications for the organization. If you're not familiar with us, we are a membership-based trade association for the medical device industry that works to bolster the medical device industry through education and networking. So events like this, advocacy and awareness. We have a great event for you today. We're going to be digging into your questions about PFAS. We have a number of experts on the line who are going to answer them for you. Before I turn it over to our team from Battelle, though, I do have a few housekeeping notes. First, this webinar is being recorded, so everyone who registered for it will get a copy of the recording. And we're also going to be able to share the slides, so you'll get those after the webinar as well. We most likely will have time for additional Q&A in addition to the ones that you submitted when you registered. So if you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and we will do our best to answer them during the time allotted today, or we'll follow up with you after the webinar. All right. Today's webinar is brought to you by our friends at Battelle. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the Battelle team to take it away. Enjoy.
Hi, everybody. My name is Shalene Thomas, and I will be leading the webinar for today. I appreciate everybody that's participating. Very excited to talk to you today and grateful for the opportunity. We did get some great questions, so this will be informal, and we'll be going through those questions in our Ask the Expert platform. So I'm just going to go over a few slides regarding Battelle. If you have not heard of Battelle, I'll give you a real quick brief on that. One slide on PFAS to hopefully give you the backbone that'll help you if you're very, very new to the topic or don't know anything about it, to better understand the answers to the questions that we're going to give you. We have categorized the questions into 3 different buckets. So we have questions around use, questions around alternatives, and questions around regulations. We have about 8 questions on use, 7 on alternatives, 3 on regulations. Those of you that did register in the last day or 2, we did get a handful more questions. I will address those if there is time available, but do know we welcome any and all questions. You can put them in the chat. If we have time at the end, we'd be happy to talk about those and or provide answers to those questions after the webinar is complete. So with that, as I mentioned, my name is Shalene Thomas. I'm the Emerging Contaminants Program Manager for Battelle. PFAS is something unfortunately near and dear to my heart. I do love the topic. I've been working on it for nearly 18 years now of my 25-year consulting career. I support clients across different industries with PFAS and strategic management globally, really. So I've supported clients here in the US, Canada, Europe, as well as South America. My background's toxicology and risk management, and most of what I do for clients, as I mentioned, is strategic management around emerging chemicals. With me today, Jeff. Jeff is going to introduce himself, and he's going to support us in the alternatives question. Jeff, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, yes. My name is Jeff Kaffmeyer. I'm a senior research scientist in our advanced materials group here at Battelle. I've worked in, my background is in chemistry and polymer chemistry, and I've worked in bio-based materials and replacement chemistries for much of my career, and more recently have worked with a number of government and industrial clients on looking at alternatives to the PFAS question of what materials can we use to replace some of these materials. Thanks.
Great, thank you. I believe we also have in our presence our medical device and health team leadership in our business development area. Andre or Dave, if you're on, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Shailene. I'll go first real quick. So Andre Lafreniere, I've been in the medical devices space for about 20 years, certainly helping to kind of bridge this conversation between some of the broader topics related to PFAS, as well as then tie it directly to the medical device development process, implications for medical device regulation, et cetera. So thanks for everyone joining today. Dave?
Yeah,
Thanks, Andre.
thanks, Andre. Much like Andre, doing the same role. Been in medical devices here at Battelle for 16 plus years. We probably have worked with many of you. Many we may not have, but look forward to getting into the PFAS discussion and talking about what we do and how we can help you.
Great, thank you both. So as you can see, you have a cross-pollination of team here. So those deep in the medical device with many years of experience, material science, as well as human health and risk. So Battelle has been around for about 100 years. We are a philanthropic trust. We are not for profit. So although we serve in a capacity as backbone doing contract research and development, we have full service laboratory offerings, as well as consulting. All of the profit that we make on an annual basis goes back into research and development with our own internal research and development programs, STEM education, as well as other philanthropic efforts. So our mission is really to advance science and technology for society's benefit. And our business model has been operating, as I mentioned, for nearly 100 years now. And really, many of you, if not all of you, I'm sure, even though you're not familiar with Battelle, you are familiar with the technologies that have been developed by Battelle. So one being the UPC barcode that you use at your grocery store when you purchase products. That's a Battelle invention. Cruise control. Any of you in football season right now, your heat seat technology for stadium cushions is another one. Dating ourselves, those of us that used compact discs, as well as aluminum foil. So we have a lot of things to be proud of here at Battelle from our research perspective.
Yeah, and I know we have a lot of health and med device folks. We have been developing medical devices for 50 plus years. So we do that under contract for our clients, providing research and development and product development services. So there's all kinds of examples that we could talk about. Too many to detail here, but I look forward to speaking about that in the future with you.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate that. So just 2 slides quickly on Battelle's PFAS experience. So similar to my own experience, Battelle has been in the PFAS realm now for almost 20 years. We have a deep bench of expertise across discipline, around 60 different staff members. So far in all of our efforts, specifically ramped up in the last 5 years, we have 7 different innovations that have been commercialized around PFAS, and that includes a forensic proprietary library that differentiates over 600 different PFAS. This is just quickly a timeline of where we started on our own journey in PFAS. Those of you that are familiar with the movie Dark Waters and the story around Parkersburg, West Virginia, Battelle supported some of the health studies early on back in 2007 surrounding some of those site issues. Moving forward, Department of Defense, we continue to support them, starting with the Westminster site in Pennsylvania. Moving forward, 2016, we developed a fully accredited laboratory to support PFAS, and more recently, we've launched full life cycle offerings that includes and ties together all of our alternatives analysis, research and development with our material sciences team. All right, I don't want to lose everybody in chemistry if you're not chemists. I am just going to share a snapshot of the PFAS family. This is nomenclature that anyone who's tried to understand the topic gets lost very, very quickly in the list of acronyms that are out there. So I think this is important as the backbone to understand some of the answers and responses to your questions today. So try to maybe commit this to memory that there is a PFAS family tree. Within that family tree, we have both non-polymers here on the left-hand side, polymers here on the right-hand side. Non-polymers are those that really started the issue with PFAS, or that's where it was resurrected. If you've heard of PFOA or PFOS, those are two common PFAS compounds that were really the first ones that were looked at. It includes both fully fluorinated perfluoroalkyl substances and then those that are not fully fluorinated, the polyfluoroalkyl substances. These tend to be chain lengths from 2 to 3 chain length all the way into the 20 plus chain length. They can be persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. Fast forward to the more recent years when products became a topic of interest in the PFAS world, and unfortunately drug in this right-hand side of the column, the polymers. So if you're trying to think of polymers and what that means, everybody I think knows what Teflon is. Think of Teflon or PFTE. That's a polymer. These are large stable molecules made up of smaller monomers. They generally are not bioavailable, and most of them considered polymers of low concern. They unfortunately have been dragged into the discussion, and that's dragging in many more industries and many more uses as we discuss PFAS in the context of both product bans, product manufacturing, and then into the environmental realm. So remember that, non-polymers and polymers. Oops. All right, so the questions about uses, I'm just flashing them up here quickly. You can zone out if they're not of interest for you. The next few minutes, we're going to talk about these 8 questions around PFAS uses. Some I have an illustration for, and some I do not. It's just my opinion, professional judgment, and status on what I know. So let's get into it here with the first question. So the first question is, what are the major challenges that the medical device industry faces related to PFAS? Now, I think there's 3 things here that need to be considered in terms of what the primary issues are. They're based on 3 drivers. So regulatory drivers, the fact that there's inconsistent regulations or lack of regulations, stakeholder pressures. So this is based on the generalization of the class. When you hear PFAS are forever chemicals and they're toxic, persistent, bioaccumulative, that doesn't fit for every PFAS chemical in the class of PFAS compounds. So on top of that, this definition has been taken and expanded scientifically, as well as in a regulatory perspective, where now the definition of a PFAS in some cases is considered a single carbon fluorine bond, which brings in everything, not just that non-polymer side of the family tree, but also the polymer side. And the third thing is obsolescence and lack of alternatives. So the challenge here, of course, is that there are 8 manufacturers in the US, 3M, DuPont, which is now Chemours, spun off to Chemours, and 6 other manufacturers that manufactured PFAS chemicals here in the US. 3M announced that they will be ceasing all operations of their fluorochemistry business by the end of next year. This is causing, of course, challenges for many that use PFAS in the space, and that may also be a challenge for medical device. So when you think of these major challenges, I would put them in these buckets. So the regulatory drivers, although EPA has regulations, medical device is mostly regulated by the FDA. However, you are getting dragged into the mix at the state regulatory level. There's several states now that are pulling in reporting requirements for products that are medical devices. The REACH restriction in Europe is another example where every industry is being looked at, and that includes the medical device industry in that draft proposal. All right, let's move on to the next question. So the next question, where are PFAS found in medical devices? Now, for those of you, I know there are a few of you attending. Most of you are way more versed in medical devices than I am. But those of you that aren't, when you think of the medical device industry, to get a better understanding, you really need to understand what does the definition of a medical device mean. And it's really broad and ranges from your, colorimetric thermometers, bandages, all the way up to implants, devices that are implanted in the body. So as you can expect, these are substantially variable. So when you think about that, and then layer on top of it where and what PFAS are used in the industry. This graphic is from a industry organization, and it comes out of an appendices from the European Chemical Agency REACH restriction proposal. And really what I wanted to showcase here is illustrate that 48% of the graph and uses in the medical device industry are actually on the right-hand side, the polymer side. So it includes packaging, hoses, seals, catheters, guide wires, tubing, devices, coatings, and things like that. So, those are considered polymers and generally of lower concern. Approximately 27% are fluorinated gases. These are used in sterilization, metered dose inhalers, contract agents, specifically for imaging techniques. So that's the other area. The remainder is really that the other non-polymer PFAS compounds. So that's where we're seeing them in the med device industry. Terms of electronics, where we're seeing them in electronics, this also is from that REACH restriction proposal, another annex of it. Ultimately, they were lumped together, electronics with semiconductors. In the electronic space, what you see here on the left-hand side is just electronics. So about 20%, which is equal to about 40%, are fluoropolymer based. The 60% are based on polymers. So that's what we're seeing in the electronics industry. All right, question 4. How do you test for PFAS in devices, and are there any analytical methods available? This is a sticky wicket, and like most things with PFAS, a really challenging question because there's not one answer, not one good answer. Like anything, it depends. So it depends on really what your data quality objectives are, the question that you're asking. So I put it in this very easy graphic, hopefully to understand and equate it to a scenario. You have a piggy bank. So you have a piggy bank and you want to understand, is there money in that piggy bank? Yes or no? Simple answer. So that would be, you have a product, you want to know if there's PFAS in that product, yes or no. You'd use these total fluorine type methods that are listed here. EPA does have a method. All of these would have to be modified for products specifically, but that would give you that yes/no answer. Good news is you get a yes/no. Bad news is you don't know which specific PFAS or which specific concentrations. The other end of the spectrum, of course, here is the targeted analysis. So if you want to know, do I have one of, anywhere from 18 to 40 different PFAS, specific PFAS in my product or in my component, you'd use a targeted analysis. So that's what's on the far right-hand side. So this gives you not only, yes, you have money in your piggy bank, but you have 20s, you have 10s, and here's the total amount of each of those. So it gives you the concentrations as well. The item in the middle really gives you a non-targeted or a suspect screening analysis. So this will tell you, yes, you have one of these PFAS analytes. So you do have money in your piggy bank, but it won't tell you how much of each you have. So they won't tell you how many 10s, how many 20s, etc. So it doesn't give you a concentration. So these are things to think about when you ask a laboratory for testing. All right, we'll move on here to the next question. Do you foresee PFAS-based technologies being phased out of medical devices? I added in here the 3 classes of medical device definition. And this is a definition FDA uses that, as all of you, many of you know, is based on risk to the patient ultimately, or to the customer. So 50% of devices fall into that class 1, so very low risk. 43 fall in that moderate risk level, and only 7% fall in the high risk level. So high risk being pacemaker, implantables for brain or other uses. When you think about technologies being phased out, my opinion is here, obviously the medical device industry as a whole is an essential use category, but you think of 50% of those are falling into a low risk medical device. I think that's where the scrutiny should be, both from a best management practice perspective, and ultimately when the regulations do come around and or maybe are coming around at the state level, focusing on those areas where you may be able to get alternatives associated with those low risk areas. The higher risk areas, the higher the risk, the more robust FDA scrutiny and process to apply for, manage, and approve a device. Those I think are longer lead times and may never end up becoming an issue. It's more about management, best management practices and mitigation to minimize exposure. Next, what's the health risks in terms of exposure and use? I'm using that graphic again. So health risks, again, loaded question because it varies on the exposure. So ultimately, what is the PFAS used? How is it being used? Is it in a body, outside of a body? So this is not an easy answer either. I will say, FDA did come out about a year ago with some documentation on evaluation and testing within a risk management process. They do consider many chemicals, including fluorinated chemistries, in that process to evaluate exposure. So I think there's some things that are happening there to cover many different chemistries that are challenging. But in terms of health exposure, you have to get down into the details even more than we are today and have time for. Questions about use. Will there be more health studies necessary to determine actual threat? There's definitely a robust body of ongoing studies, ongoing academic research, literature happening every day. When I started this back in 2017, it was maybe one a month. It's exploded in terms of all the facets of research that are ongoing. So I do anticipate more health studies coming out. I don't think they are all necessary. I do think there's necessity on the non-polymer side of the family in terms of exposure, but less so on the non-polymer side. I think it's well documented for most of that as to the challenges from a patient perspective. All right, question 8. Are there environmental issues in the manufacture of medical devices? So again, you have to consider what are you calling the medical device, or what medical device are you thinking about specifically? And you also have to think about the risk paradigm and framework. Risk is you have an actual hazard and you have an exposure. So number one, do you have a hazard? If it's a polymer of low concern, is it in fact a hazard? Is it a hazard in a manufacturing setting, a use setting, or a disposal waste setting? So I think from all of these aspects, you really have to think through how is the PFAS being used. You may have exposure in a manufacturing setting. A lot of the non-polymers are actually used in the production and manufacturing of the polymer chemistries. Another thing, when you introduce heat to the process, you can have ambient releases, volatilization of PFAS. So you do see it definitely in the manufacturing setting. And then, of course, in disposal and waste, that's a potential realm as well that you're going to see it. So short answer, yes. Longer answer, you really need to dig into it. Depends on the medical device that you're looking at. So I've done a whole lot of talking. I'm going to pass it now and actually get Jeff on here so he can answer some of these questions. And Jeff, I'll pose these to you individually if you want to come off mute.
Okay.
All right. So Jeff, so what alternatives are available?
Well, as you described before, that it is it's a question that it depends. There are alternatives. The issue is how it's being used and what it needs to, what properties it needs to have. There's a whole host of different attributes that this carbon fluorine bond provides. It's usually the pinnacle of durability on these applications. So it's inert. It provides a lot of different characteristics for some of the materials. We're looking at heat exchange fluids and that, and they're non-flammable. They've got great properties, high density, but volatility, and so there's a lot of different attributes and maybe multiple ones that are being used at or in any one application or scenario. And so the answer is that there are alternatives, but it depends on each case whether there's an adequate alternative for that material, or perhaps it's a bit more of a trade-off in deciding what is an acceptable alternative.
Good, thank you. So one question we received was, I saw on the Battelle website, surgical gloves, blood bags, catheters can contain PFAS. I would like to know why.
Yeah, a lot of this is around, in these particular applications, would be around the basically the container or the surface coating of these materials, whether it's fully made out of a fluorinated polymer or as a coating. But they're looking for chemical resistance or biological resistance in not growing any material on that surface. These fluorinated materials tend to be very low surface energy and low surface tension, so things don't bind organisms don't bind well to the surface. They don't foul the surface. And they're also hydrophobic and oleophobic. So that's the reason why they're in there. And you can determine whether how resistant do they need to be, and so that's, again, underlying, it provides those types of properties in these applications.
Great, thank you. So can you give successful examples of PFAS replacement for medical staff clothing made of polymer materials?
Well, I don't know specifically what this refers to. I mean, clothing had been using a lot of different PFAS materials, again, to provide some hydrophobicity and oleophobicity to the materials, prevent basically, I mean, that's all your stain resistant clothing. But a lot of that is migrated away from using PFAS So there are some alternatives, silicone-based type materials, but I'm not specifically aware of what's that PFAS is currently being used in these in clothing at this point because of the concern over it. That is largely being eliminated.
Great. So after 3M ceases PFAS production in 2025, will specific stable materials like PTFE still be available from other sources, perhaps offshore?
Well, I guess 3M not producing it. There are other producers of these materials. I anticipate that there still will be a supply of these types of materials. As a polymer chemist, I rely on a lot of these types of materials, and there's properties that you just do not obtain from other materials. So I presume that there will still be others that will still manufacture and provide those, although 3M will not.
Yeah. And I would add to that, we are seeing right now in some of the other industry spaces, many industries benchmark against one another. So semiconductor industry, as an example, there are some alternatives that are out there, but it's on the user as to does it meet and is it fit for purpose for the intended use. So I would think the medical device is going to have challenges with obviously use and registration of a new material, but just in the capacity and capability of the material and what it's intended for in a medical device application. But we are seeing things start to come out slowly. But I anticipate and hopefully have imparted something here already today in that polymer space versus the non-polymers. I think it's a very, very slow train that's moving in terms of complete elimination from the supply chain, both in the US and globally. All right, is there a solution to replace 3M's FC40 for medical devices gross leak testing?
So, this is another case of 3M provides hydrofluorocarbon, a fluorocarbon, perfluorocarbon in this FC40 as an engineering fluid used in a lot of different applications, not only in this leak detection apparently, but there are other alternative suppliers of this material. As well as there could be other fluids that perform the same function. This one has a particular range of properties, and that could be covered by perhaps one or two other alternatives if there was a real need to have that broader range of characteristics. But again, it is a material that 3M produces, but not exclusively.
Okay, so that is good news for those that rely on it. All right, number 6, what are the specific constraints for materials containing PFAS used as components in medical device manufacturing?
Well, I think as we're hearing, there's obviously a drive to eliminating all fluorinated substances out of products, and I think that that will be done on most of those non-essential aspects. So, but where it's effective to have an alternative, we're going to be able to insert those into that process, but others are, and it's going to depend on what is the acceptable alternatives that are there. And again, that's on a case by case basis, determining what that overall need is and whether the hazard and risk outweigh or that calculation that it's going to have to go on.
I know, Jeff, it's always enlightening when I talk to you, and it came up in one of our recent conversations about how fluorochemistry, especially on the polymer side, thought as of inert, stable, low toxicity, and obviously ubiquitous use. And I saw this in other arenas. So as an example, in the firefighting foam area, where people treated it like soap, oh, I'm going to clean my vehicle with it. I have this extra foam. They used it in that inert understanding that, it wasn't going to cause a problem. But it's because, so they often over-designed and overused the product because they thought it was inert and, oh, that has all these wonderful characteristics and phys chem properties that I can use here and there, but not necessarily needed. So I think what we're seeing in other industries, and maybe something to think about for medical devices, rolling back to what's the primary fit for purpose? What's your primary intention and need from a functional perspective for a product or material, right?
Yes, I completely agree.
Yeah. All right. Number 7, should low molecular weight polyfluoromolecules also be considered PFAS? I don't know if you have an opinion on that.
Well, from a chemistry standpoint, I mean, I think that it ends up being the stability and persistence of these molecules that ends up being kind of the deciding line or the threshold for whether they're considered to be more PFAS. I mean, it's the persistence, the durability of these materials that is what they're known for, but it is also the downfall in what we're seeing in their use. So being more selective in what we're using. In this case, I mean, this is, there are worse materials than others, and some of them, whether you look at them from a global warming potential or that type of impact, or again just the persistence and accumulation that is the overriding concern. Not all small molecules are going to be that stable, and so there is some delineation, but I'm not sure where that is.
Yeah. I think, in my opinion, so dating myself a bit back to 2011, I had the opportunity to work with Bob Buck, who was with DuPont, then Chemours, and he's now retired. But he was the one who published at that time and coined the term PFAS. And he did it because prior to that, it was being called PFCs, or perfluorochemicals. Bob wanted to separate, those are greenhouse gases, perfluorochemicals. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about these non-polymer, perfluoroalkyl substances, which he felt were separate and distinct. So his intention was good. However, the train left the station years after that, I think, because the word and moniker PFAS and the definition started to expand to a point where it's ridiculous as a 1 CF bond. Years later, in 2018, he did publish another study that again tried to rein it back in and say, I think it was 2018, and say that, okay, let's just look at what's commercially available. And he scoured through all these different definitions that OECD had, that states had, that European Chemical Agency had, and came up with a list of just over 250 PFAS chemicals that he said, these are the ones we need to worry about because they're in commerce. We don't need to worry about the everything else, the tens of thousands, and depending on the definition, up to 1 million different PFAS. So he again tried to rope it back in, but both of those times, the intention was not to include these. So I do agree that they should not be considered, especially some of those greenhouse gases should not be considered PFAS. There is already legislation in Europe that was proposed for fluorine gases, that F-gas legislation, is covering greenhouse gases. There is the Montreal Protocol. There's other avenues, I think, that cover the intended regulation around those things. How will legislation change for medical devices? I think medical device at the bottom of the list because you have this, essential use definition. Others ahead of you, refrigeration, and those types of industries are struggling with what PFAS means to them first. And I think they'll fight the fight for everybody's benefit. All right, anything else, Jeff, you want to say before we move on to the regulatory bucket?
Nope, I'm good, thank you.
Thanks, I appreciate it. All right, so moving on into regulations. Three questions only that we will go through here for regulations. We're making good time. I think we've got 15, 20 minutes or so left. So let's cut into those now. All right, so what are the resources available to understand the details of the requirements by state? And are they updated as they change? So I've put two resources here. You're going to want to write this down. The deck will be available and the recording's available after the webinar. But the first is ITRC, which stands for Interstate Technology Regulatory Council. This is a group that's been around for many, many years. And it's a combination of environmental leadership at different state environmental regulatory agencies come together around a common problem and develop technical regulatory content, fact sheets, training, and tracking tools as well. So back over 8 years ago now, I submitted a proposal with a couple colleagues to suggest a team around PFAS. So that team has been now going on for several years. Over 600 volunteers large, both from environmental consultants like myself, academics, and industry, all working together to try and develop some standardized information and understanding of an issue such as PFAS. So the website specifically for PFAS is pfas-1.itrcweb.org. You can see this here on the left-hand side. When you get to this page, there is data tables, this middle button here. Within that data tables, there's a few resources that are super valuable, I think, for anybody that has to deal with this. So number one is environmental regulatory criteria. That's in the environment. So soil, air, groundwater, drinking water, are there environmental regulatory requirements? And it shows federal, it shows state, and it shows international as they're available to us. That's updated about every 6 weeks. On this data tables tab as well is a regulatory tracking of proposed, pending regulations, and they are categorized by AFFF, general products, drinking water, environmental. That table is updated less frequently, but it is a really good check and balance compared to what your knowledge is, to check and see where the status of things are at. When I say less regularly, I feel like it's every quarter, 4 to 5 months maybe. So that's ITRC, and I highly recommend if you need to get into this. The fact sheets are super digestible, give you really good base information that gives you clarity before you have to jump into anything. The right-hand side is the PFAS Project Lab. So the PFAS Project Lab is funded from the National Science Foundation and the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. So it's run by academics through this grant funding. You can see here there's several tabs. So it's pfasproject.com. They have a PFAS governance tracker. That is better than the ITRC tool. So the ITRC is a Excel file that you can download at a point in time, and then they update it periodically. This database is live and updated much more frequently, I think on a monthly basis or so, and it will go that way as long as they have funding. But they have everything in there from proposed in the House, proposed in the Senate, passed, the date, the link to the actual reg. This one is a lot more comprehensive. Good check and balance with the ITRC resources, but I'd highly suggest that. They also have some other great resources around the tox database, PFAS sites. So if you're looking at from a understanding of where there are potential contaminated sites that if you operate near them, you may get a finger pointed at you. They have a database around that too. So this is also a great site. All right, so next regulatory question. How are non-polymer PFAS projected to be regulated in the US and the EU in coming years? So the EU and the US have been different and do operate differently from a regulatory perspective as to how they tackle some of these challenges. So in the US tends to identify emerging chemicals and issues through their Safe Drinking Water Act unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. So every 5 years, different chemicals are suggested to look at across the water utilities in the US, serving the different populations from 10,000 and greater and lower than 10,000. They develop that list, sample, and determine based on the frequency of occurrence if they need to move into any type of regulatory environment. That's what triggers it here in the US. From there, it moves into drinking water guidelines or requirements, regulated, promulgated drinking water rules, and then also adopted from or the information used in that derivation can be adopted for soil criteria for cleanup, groundwater criteria for cleanup, air criteria for cleanup, which has happened. So we have seen that in the non-polymer space here in the US. And they're doing it so far on a chemical by chemical basis. Slow, expensive, and not adequate. So that's the approach here in the US. In Europe, the approach has always been, not just for PFAS, but a lot more scrutiny on the chemicals going into commerce and evaluation of those chemicals into commerce. So utilizing tools like the Stockholm Convention, PFOA, PFAS, have been a persistent POP for several years, almost as long as I've been in this PFAS arena. What we're seeing though now is those two trains not only crossing paths, but going beyond each other. So now we're seeing here in the US, the product regulations increasing, and we're seeing in Europe, the environmental regulations increasing. What does that mean in the coming years for non-polymers? I think there's a lot of unique and innovative toxicological tools that are being used so that PFAS can be looked more on a class basis. And by class, I don't mean all PFAS are equal, which is unfortunately where we are in some regulatory places, but rather looking at them by function, by property, by similar function and mechanism, so that you can do a read across based on one chemical that you know to those that are similar, and then develop regulatory drivers around each of those. So I do think that's the way it's going to be moving forward. In some of the environmental arenas, the drinking water rule that passed, the Superfund cleanup rule that has passed for two chemicals, drinking water rule for 6 chemicals. They're all being challenged. So the litigious nature in the US is definitely slowing things down. All right, and I think this is our last question. How will the current regulations intentionally added PFAS to products impact this market? So when we look at the medical device specifically and how it may impact the medical device industry specifically, we're not seeing much in the US. There's obviously a lot of supply chain pressures, stakeholder pressures, whether it's investors, users, regulatory authorities. We're seeing a lot of probing, but from a hard regulatory perspective, the only thing that we've really seen here in the US on the product side with intentionally added PFAS, is at some of the state level. So Minnesota as an example, although medical devices are omitted from an elimination perspective for PFAS in use, they are still required to be reported. So how much is used, when, where specifically. So that reporting requirement is moving forward in Minnesota. So that's really where we are, I think, on the current regulations impacting this market. Everything else, whether it's the REACH restriction, anything that may happen at the federal level, still very slow moving train, I think, from a regulatory perspective. And that is it, I think, for the questions that we received. As I said, I did receive a few more. I'm going to just address one that was very general that came in the last couple of days that wasn't on our list. And that was, where do I start? So it is definitely overwhelming, and it definitely can suck you into a black hole very quickly. For the medical device industry, and as ultimately users of PFAS, understanding where you're using the PFAS, how much you're using of it, which specific PFAS you have, is the best starting point. So a vulnerability assessment to really give you an inventory of what you have, where, and why. That functional purpose, as Jeff and I talked about, what's the functional purpose of the PFAS in that use that you are using? And is there a method or approach to an alternative path? I think this is a best management practice that everyone should do, so that you understand, one, sort of what the lay of the land is for you organizationally, and then you can extrapolate that to what is your liability, what is your risk, and then how do you manage and mitigate. So that's a good starting point, putting those specific PFAS in. Is it polymer or non-polymer? Hopefully you have a good understanding of where those two sit. Also a good exercise, because you can then focus on those non-polymers, which tend to be the more persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic.
Hey, Celine, there's a few
Yes.
questions out there on the chat that
Yes,
we could run through.
sure. Let me take a look. I have those.
Can you pull those up, or do you want me to read those to you?
I think I can get there. Oh, I just see. Can you read to me? Because I just see. Please feel free to ask questions.
Yeah, there's 3 that are open. What is your opinion on the EU PFAS exemption for medical devices? There is currently an extension to 2037. Many interventional catheters have PTFE lining. Should these device manufacturers phase out PTFE if there is potential for a further extension?
Yeah. So I can appreciate that comment and appreciate the anxiety because of the sheer nature and volume and use of PTFE in that application, and the ability to actually get FDA approval for any type of alternative. You need to start now. What I think you should do is track it from the other user's perspective. So every other industry that's using PTFE also has to understand this, also has to invest in research and development, and also has to transition to alternatives. This can be the leading edge for you to define and dictate your strategy and approach. Because I do think it's coming, but to the medical device industry specifically as it relates to polymers and PTFE, 2037 is going to come and go, in my opinion.
Here's another one. What chemicals that contain PFAS do we not have a replacement for? Also, do you know of a database of chemicals that contain PFAS? Might be a good one for Jeff.
Yeah, so I'm just going to comment on the database question first, and then Jeff can speak up. So the database in terms of understanding what PFAS are out there, if you Google EPA Comp Tox database, the EPA Comp Tox database not only gives you all of the PFAS that are tracked, but it also gives you the regulatory lists that they fall into. Do they fall into TSCA? Do they fall into OECD? And as well as phys-chem properties, toxicity properties, and it's a holistic one-stop shop. So that's the one I would suggest. Jeff, do you have any thoughts?
I'm not aware of any kind of comprehensive list of products that are reported to contain them. I mean, I think it sounds like a very large job to really kind of find where all of them could be, and whether that's going through getting that information from manufacturers specifically, other than the ones that are obviously created from or they inherently contain them. But there's other formulations that are going to be containing PFAS materials. They're just widely used in formulations, and so it's going to be very challenging to come up with the comprehensive list.
Yeah, there is some generic resources that are good that give you some footing. So Gluge et al. Has done a couple papers now that outline which specific chemistries are in what industry application. I also have done with a previous firm work with ChemSec, CHEMSEC. ChemSec has, again, also tried to define and use some of the industry resources that are out there, where and what specific PFAS are used, but they also have a PFAS alternatives database that they've developed and they continue to update. And that PFAS alternatives database is very cursory in that it identifies, back to our discussion on functional use, Jeff, it defines this PFAS, it's used in this application because of this functional use. Yep. Here's an alternative because that alternative fits that functional use. So it's a starting point.
Hey, everyone, I know that we're at time, so thank you very much. We're more than willing to continue this Q&A. Please, you have Shailene's email. Please feel free to email us any questions, and we'll be or the ones that have remained unanswered. We'll be happy to address those individually.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thanks everybody for your time. This QR code will actually get you to my calendar if you want just a 15-minute catch up. Happy to do that. And this is all recorded and content will be provided. So thank you. Thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for such a great presentation. Thank you for your expertise, all the speakers from Battelle. Thank you for joining us today. You will be receiving a copy of this after the webinar, as well as the slides. And I encourage you to go visit massmedic.com/events and check out all the other great events we have coming up. And we'll see you next time. Thanks. Take care.